You will not be able to unmute yourself for the rest of the meeting. If you have a question at any point, please use the chat box. Please note that in the chat box, you can send a message to everyone or just to the host. And during the question and answer time, you may also raise your hand and we will unmute you to ask your question live. To raise your hand, click on the participants in the control panel at the bottom of your Zoom window. You will see a raise hand button at the bottom of the participant window. Speakers will be sharing presentations. When we are not in presentation mode, it may help focus your view if you select the speaker view instead of the gallery view from the upper right hand corner of your Zoom window. You can also minimize the video ribbon when a speaker is sharing their screen. All right, sorry about that, everybody. Looks like Kelly muted me too when she muted everybody. So we're going to start over here, and I'm going to introduce Zach Vega. Zach is a community planner with LIAI, the Land Information Access Association, a nonprofit based out of Traverse City, Michigan. Zach works with a range of stakeholders throughout Michigan on community planning projects at the local, regional, and state levels that promote innovative and sustainable land use decisions. So welcome, Zach.
Thank you very much. Let me make sure I got my screen up. Let's see. All right, can everybody see? Is that visible?
Yeah, I'm seeing, there it goes.
Okay, great. I took it.
Thanks, Zach.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Like I was introduced, I'm a planner with the Land Information Access Association. And from what I saw from the presentations this morning, they're a lot more specific than my level of expertise. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 10,000 feet in the air approach that LIAI's been taking, that we've been working with communities for the last few years on coastal resilience planning. But I want to talk a little bit about a new tool that we've developed that I think might be useful to all of you who are planners or who want to start a planning approach in your community, and also how we've adjusted during coronavirus to actually get this into action. But before I start, I want to thank our funders and our program partners. So we're funded by Eagle and NOAA for these projects that we've been working on for the last few years. And our partners at Michigan Tech, the University of Michigan, and MACC have been really instrumental in helping us with these efforts. And basically what we've been doing is studying and analyzing exactly what's going on with the Great Lakes shoreline and what that presents, how that presents as a coastal hazard along the Great Lakes shoreline. And then taking that information and figuring out the legal implications for what communities can do with their zoning regulations and other regulatory approaches to actually make themselves more resilient. So we take that information and we try to engage citizens across the state in these coastal communities. We try to meet with public officials and community stakeholders. And really what we're trying to do is help them inform their land use policy and their planning efforts so that they're more hazard ready going into the future. And so before I get into actually how that planning process works out, I just wanted to mention that we, through the Coastal Management Program, we have a one-to-one matching grant opportunity going on right now. So you have to be a coastal community. And this runs out December 2020. All the work has to be done by then. And we'll basically work with communities to run through the planning process that I'm going to talk about right now, with assessing local coastal resilience, where you're at, where you could be, and then working with you and the public to develop goals and objectives to actually get some initiatives written down that you can actually work towards. And so if you're interested in all this and the work that we're doing, you can visit resilientmichigan.org. Here you can find our grant information by clicking here. You can also see the communities that we've worked with in the past and the ones that we're currently working with. And then the Documents tab is where you'll find the resource that I'm about to talk about, as well as other resilience handbooks and tools that our project partners have created over the years. As everyone has these days, we also host a podcast, our Welcome To podcast for community planners and other practitioners across the state. So we just kicked off our Know the Great Lakes series. We have 3 episodes in on that series. So we talked to Dr. Richard Norton from the University of Michigan on the legal implications for these coastal planning and regulatory approaches. We talked to Guy Meadows from Michigan Tech, who I'll talk about today, and the science behind the Great Lakes, as well as Matt Warner from the state of Michigan, and we have more speakers to come. Aside from coastal resilience, we also talk about other planning approaches such as charrettes and self-driving vehicles, planning law, philosophy, all of that good stuff. And there's the link at LIAI.org/podcast if you're interested in checking that out. So getting into the actual planning process that we've been working with, we do a 3-meeting approach just because, and typically we would do more meetings, but since we can't meet with people in person, we've been sticking to this 3-meeting approach with feedback loops. So we start with our public kickoff, and that's when we invite our CRT or our coastal resilience team. So that's typically Michigan Tech and U of M, to get the entire community. So we invite as many people as possible into the room, or now into the Zoom meeting, to all get on the same page as to what exactly is going on the Great Lakes coastline, and the science that really informs what we're doing with our coastal decisions and our land use planning. And then also, like I mentioned before, the legal implications for that and what rights the community has to take to make themselves more resilient. How does that conflict with property rights, or how can it conflict with property rights? And what are you actually able to accomplish from a legal perspective? So once we've got everyone on the same page, and if you're interested in seeing one of our public kickoffs, you can go to that Resilient Michigan website. And we just did one a couple weeks ago in Fort Gratiot Township along Lake St. Clair. And then we've also, there should be others up there as well from the Upper Peninsula that we just did. So once we've got the community on the same page, that's when we want to meet with our key stakeholders. So we facilitate a discussion with local leaders, so planning commissioners, planners, engineering department, city council, a host of people who are actually tasked with implementing the master plan once it's been adopted. And so what we do with them is we go through the sustainability self-assessment tool, question by question, to see what's working well, what's not working well. And then we actually get them to form, from that information, a vision statement. And we want to make sure we're not forming any goals and objectives in this second stakeholder meeting. We're really holding that off to the final meeting when we meet with the wider community and the public at large to actually show them what the vision is, what our local leaders think can be accomplished based on the data that they've been given. And then that's when we take all of that information, we take the goals and objectives that the public forms, and we put that into a master plan chapter that can back up a lot of the information or a lot of the action steps that you want to take. So just really briefly, this is sort of this is an extremely brief description of what's going on along the Great Lakes. So as we all know, the water's at the highest it's ever been. Happily, it's been projected to start going down in the near future. We're not exactly sure when. We're not sure how far it's going to go down. But it's important to note that the Great Lakes fluctuate every 10 to 15 years. And so when you consider the fact that most homeowners are in one site for, on average, about 7 years, you've got a lot of people moving to communities across the Great Lakes, and they're seeing this huge, from 2000 to about 2015, they saw huge swaths of beach, white sandy beach that Michigan's famous for, and they thought, wow, what a great place to build our beach house. But what they didn't understand is that these decadal patterns that we're working around, that's land that was most likely underwater just 10 years ago. And so it's really important that we get that word out to our public about what's going on along the Great Lakes and to all of our municipal officials so that we can plan accordingly to make sure that we're not putting development in risky areas. And so that's, like I mentioned, our first, here's Ethan Therakoff from Michigan State at one of our UP presentations discussing these changes in lake levels over the years. And that's really what we're trying to get across to people in this sense, is making sure that the entire community's understanding of the fact that unlike the oceans, which go in and out twice a day, we're dealing with a 10 to 15 year pattern, which makes our planning a lot more difficult because, people typically plan for next year or 5 years, but we need to really be taking a 30 to 40 year approach with our land use planning along our coastlines. And so a great resource I want to point out is from Dr. Guy Meadows from Michigan Tech. So I encourage you, I won't do it right now, but go to this link, geospatialresearch.mtu.edu. It's an 80-year look at the shoreline. And his team started with Lake Michigan, they've completed Lake Huron, and now they're working on Lake Superior. And what you can see right here is the blue line is the difference in shoreline over different periods of time. So you can see when the shoreline's right here, you've got all this area that's beach. That's when the development pressure comes in. And then here is obviously where the shoreline is now. The orange line shows where the bluff is and how it's changed over time. And then the red dashed lines show the 30-year bluff erosion projections. So what you can see here is using this tool, you can actually see mapped out which areas are at risk. These homes are in dangerous areas right here. You can actually see how that's working. So now I'll talk about our community sustainability self-assessment tool, which we've been using to get these conversations going with communities. We break it down into the three main categories of what we call the triple bottom line of sustainability. So the economic, the social, and the environmental. And because our funder is obviously the Coastal Management Program, we also create a coastal category, but we encourage you to look at all of these categories. There's only over 250 benchmarks that we use. But I'll just talk about the coastal ones today to give you some idea of the questions that we're asking local officials when we start working with them. So the way the assessment tool works and how it differs from a lot of assessment tools you'll find is that it doesn't go on a 1 to 10 or a 1 to 5 rating. There's no final score. It's just a yes, we're doing this. Yes, we're doing it, but we can improve. No, we're not doing it. I don't know. We need to look further into if we're doing this. Or not applicable. You know, our community doesn't have dunes, so this dune benchmark doesn't really apply to us. But we work with the community to go through all of these benchmarks and actually ask, should we be planning for this? What's missing? Is this in our master plan, but not our Parks and Rec plan? Is it in our zoning ordinance, but it's not backed up by our master plan? This is really the time to hash that out. And that's the discussion that we facilitate in that second meeting that I mentioned. So just going through this real briefly, the 9 categories that make up the coastal sustainability benchmark. So we've got the data gathering and mapping, and this is really key to any planning process. The first step that you want to take is making sure that you understand what areas are at risk and being able to take that to the public in a really clear and concise way to make sure that they understand the risk and the need to plan for this. And also, from a legal perspective, this is typically where I say I'm not an attorney, but I'm aware enough of Michigan planning law to say that whenever you're making zoning regulations to make yourself more resilient and you're infringing on private property rights in a way that's really necessary and I'm you know, if you're a private property owner, you know, I don't want to say that the community should be taking all your rights away, but there are some regulatory steps that the community should be taking in a lot of instances to make sure that development's not going into risky areas. You want to make sure that that's backed by your plan, and the data is a really key part of doing that. So you want to be benchmarking. Another key aspect of this is benchmarking your climate risks. So looking at past property damages, the number of people in our structures at risk, the public spending that you spent on disaster recovery in the past. Making sure that you're benchmarking those so that you understand what you should be working towards. The other thing along with data gathering is if you've got properties that are in NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, are you keeping track of the ones that are being repeatedly damaged of more than $1,000 or more? Are you keeping track of those repetitive loss properties? Are your plans, including the hazard mitigation plan, describing the damages and the cost of previous storms? So you want to make sure that the data from the past, as well as the projections of the future, are all laid out in your documents to make sure that you're making sound decisions based on what you're seeing. Now, in terms of zoning regulations, I talked a little bit about, this is a map of Grand Haven here. We sort of highlight Grand Haven as a great community for what they've done with their zoning and are continuing to try to do with their zoning to make themselves more resilient based on the data that we worked with them to look at in terms of their risk to floods in different scenarios. But not only in terms of locational standards, but does your zoning ordinance cover things like native vegetation requirements, making sure that people can't just remove all the native vegetation when they build there? Are there impervious surface requirements or incentives in place? Is there a buffer area or setbacks from areas that are at risk of flooding? How far are those setbacks? So, you know, a best practice is typically 50 feet. If you want to reduce your risk even more, perhaps increase that. If you're okay with taking on more risk, lower it. But you should have a buffer in place, and a lot of Michigan communities don't have setbacks from their flood-prone areas. It's a surprisingly high number. And then in terms of structural design near dunes and bluffs, so this is really important for the western side of the state, not as much so for the eastern side of the state. But there's a lot of regulatory approaches you can take to make sure that the developments that are going into the areas near the dunes and bluffs are more suited to not exacerbate the natural dune. So the natural dune process is that they're going to erode and they're going to come back. But when we put development along these areas, it really exacerbates that change. And that's what we really want to avoid. We want the beach and the dunes to be moving at a rate that are as natural as possible. So are the coastal homes in these areas regulated to have a smaller footprint? So maybe you encourage two-story homes with a smaller first floor area as opposed to a large ranch-style home. That's one example. Our homes sit on dunes designed to avoid a concentrated dispersion of rainwater. That's also important to avoiding the erosion process being exacerbated. And along with that as well, our homes on dunes allowed to use pervious surfaces. So a lot of communities, their zoning regulations don't even allow driveways to have pervious surfaces where the rainwater can more easily infiltrate. And then same with sharing driveways. A lot of communities don't allow it, but in terms of reducing the amount of impervious surface, we encourage sharing driveways along dunes. Now going along with house siting, this is sort of the same idea of where you're actually allowing houses to be built, especially in regard to really critical habitats and really at-risk natural features such as dunes and beaches. So are coastal homes designed to work with natural features? Are they prevented from being built close to the crest of the dune? I mean, so that's not even just a matter of preventing the exacerbation of the natural process, but also making sure that the residents are building in a place that's safe for them to build. So we don't want them to be building in a place where they're at risk of losing that home in the near future, as we're seeing all across the shoreline at this time. And then same thing with incentivizing or regulating homes to be built at the point of arrival. So what we mean by that is being built close to the road as opposed to having a long driveway that stretches all the way out to the dune, but actually making sure that, especially along these areas, we don't want to have a lot of impervious surfaces. So all sort of the same concept, but a different way of looking at each of those. Now with critical facilities and infrastructure, we really encourage communities to take a look at where they're placing their police stations, their fire stations, their hospitals, their important records, all infrastructure and facilities that are critically important, especially if you're experiencing flooding or wind damage or extreme heat. You want to make sure that these are all in areas that can continue to provide services during an emergency. So we have around 5 benchmarks, 7 benchmarks in this category to make sure that communities are taking a look at where they're putting their critical infrastructure. And also, as many communities are finding out right now, I mean, there's a lot of lakeshore drives across Michigan that were not planned for. And right now it's a time where people are really thinking about do we need to update our transportation infrastructure? So when the water goes back down, let's not forget about the issues that we're running into. Do we need to elevate our roads? Do we need to consider moving our roads landwards as erosion occurs? Do we need to incorporate future flooding and lake level rise data into the consideration for culvert size and placement? All of these are questions that we want our local officials to be asking for our community to be aware of when we're planning for resilience. And then going into disaster preparedness, this is really just making sure that your population is taken care of during a disaster, and also that you have backup plans in place in case your critical facilities are down. So we're not only talking about flooding in this sense, but with LIAI's planning efforts, we also tend to map vulnerable populations. And based on a lot of studies, the populations that are most susceptible during a natural disaster are the low income, the elderly, the disabled, people living alone, and those who are spatially isolated. We help map those populations out so that communities can ask, do we have emergency facilities that are located near these areas? Do we have emergency facilities at all? And if we do, are we making them well known to the public for the instance that we need to use them? And then also, as a lot of you know, a lot of this work happens in the capital improvement plan. So one thing that we like to encourage communities to think about is, is everyone contributing? Do you have a wide array of viewpoints contributing to your capital improvement plan? So a lot of communities work in silos and they just have the engineering department do it or just the planning department do it. You really want to make sure that your professional planners, your engineers, your floodplain managers, your police, your fire department are all contributing to that plan to make sure that all considerations are in place. And in that sense, it makes you more ready for a disaster should it occur. Going back to bluffs and ravines, so obviously bluffs, they play an important role in the environment, the economic, and the social sustainability of a place. So they're really important to the meeting that triple bottom line. And obviously they're a tourism draw. People, they travel to Michigan to see the bluffs. They provide a natural barrier for coastal homes from flooding. So they're critical for us to protect. And if we develop near them and we put them at risk, we lose a key asset. So planning for dunes and bluffs is critical. Ravines are important to sustain in order to reduce the risk of flooding to nearby properties. And so we have a couple of questions that we like to work with municipal officials on, asking them, do you require setbacks from these bluffs and ravines for new structures? Have you identified properties that are at risk? So that map I showed you with the red hash lines, you can actually see which properties are at risk using that map. And we encourage communities to start thinking about, do we need to start working with these residents? Do we need to start putting incentives or regulations in place or buyouts to make sure that people aren't at danger of losing their homes and that their safety isn't at risk from these natural processes? So that's a really important thing to think about, especially on the western side of the state, is are you planning for bluff and ravine protection? And then also in the sense of revitalizing our bluffs, do you have a program in place that works to help stabilize your dunes? So this might include a grassroots effort to replant native beach grass and put some of the natural features back in place that help stop the erosion from taking place. So those are all things that we like to ask communities to consider and think about when they're updating their master plan or their capital improvement plan or what have you. And then also, second to last, we want to think about professional training. So this is all well and good. These are all great ideas, but you have to have the people in place to get it done. So if you want to implement these best practices, you're more positioned to do so when you have planning commissioners and a planning staff with formal education and planning. And that can be exactly what we're doing today, attending conferences, attending online workshops. Do you have a floodplain manager that's certified as a floodplain manager on staff? Are you using GIS? Are you using the up-to-date data? All of that's important. So this is just a pretty straightforward checklist of all of the professional attributes that you would want to see in your municipal government to make sure that you're in the best place possible to make sure that you're working towards resilience and that you actually have the know-how in place to, once these are identified in the master plan's goals, to actually implement the action steps. All right, and so finally, I'll just talk quickly here about the hazard planning. So once you've got all of this in place, once you've considered all of that, it's important to plan for it. So it's not enough just to have the best staff on place. It's not enough to have considered all of this. You have to engage the public. And that's where you want to get their input, grow consensus, because that's where your budget and the initiative comes from, is having a public that backs efforts that make you more resilient. And that's all coming down to get the public to engage with you. It has to, there has to be clear direction, there has to be clear data, and there has to be clear steps that you're willing to take to implement all of this and that are supported by the public. So one of the hardest things that we see is you have all these goals and objectives that you've worked on for your hazard mitigation, but you haven't engaged the public, and now it's hard to get funding, it's hard to get public support to actually implement these projects. And that's typically not a good sign for actually getting these things done. And so those are the coastal categories. And we go over all of those in these meetings, obviously not in person anymore. This is some work we did in Port Austin, this image here. And we review that self-assessment and some of the mapping data that we collect. And I'll show you an image of that mapping data in a second. And what we do, like I said, is we draft a vision statement, and we sort of get all the key stakeholders on the same page, the people who can implement all of this, before we go to the public to gather their input and get their backing for these initiatives. And one of the big, so this is an example from Bridgman here, this map on the right, is we work, when you're working with the public, it's great to present scenarios, and it's great to present options of how much risk you want to take on. So here I'm showing the lucky, the expected, and the perfect storm future is what we call them. So the lucky, the lake levels are down, you might get a 100-year storm, it's pretty normal. And then all the way down to the perfect storm future, the lake levels are at their record highs like they are right now, and you get that 500-year storm. And so with that, a lot of the land use planning can center around, okay, how much risk do we want to take on? Are we willing to accept the risk that comes with just planning for the lucky future? Or do we want to be more risk averse and look at that perfect storm mapping and not allow development in these areas? And so this is the option. These are the options that we typically present to communities with the data that we've used. And that's what it really comes down to is giving ownership of these projects to the public and not making decisions for them, but working with them to create a solution to make yourself more resilient. So I'll stop my time there. I know that was a lot of information to put into a half hour, but I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Sure, and thank you for that, Zach. So a couple questions here, and they look a little bit related. So, Zach, maybe you know, are there any tools that are looking at rising water levels and how that will impact inland waterways like rivers and inland lakes? And do you know how are communities planning for that?
I don't know of any tools off the bat. For a lot of the projects that we work on, the inland waterways are considered if it's a coastal community that touches a Great Lake. So if it has a river system, a riverine system going into the community from a Great Lake, we do map that using the FEMA flood mapping, as well as the digital elevation mapping and everything else that goes into how we create those lucky, expected, perfect storm maps. But outside of that, I'm not sure who else is providing the resource to actually look at the inland waterways if it's not a coastal community.
And somewhat related, Zach, have you seen other communities impacted by your high water tables and longer ponding times, not just at the shoreline, but further inland, thanks to our record lake levels?
What was that question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's so we're looking at high water tables and longer ponding times as a result of high lake levels. Have you seen other communities impacted, not just at the shoreline, but further inland?
I mean, not necessarily through my work, just through personal experience of living in Lansing when the river flooded a couple years ago. Traverse City, where I live now, has been dealing with it along the Boardman River for quite a while now. A lot of the places where people used to put their boat in have been underwater since I moved here. So yeah, that's been a key issue as well, is not just planning for the shoreline erosion, which is really what we want communities to think about, but also thinking about the overall flood risk and making sure that you're using pervious surfaces and increasing the amount of tree canopy that you have and other practices that can actually help reduce that.
All right, and then one last one here. What is the typical match amount for a community seeking a grant to go through this process? Yeah,
so it really depends on what the community is looking to get out of it. So if it's just running through the assessment tool, it's hard to provide costs because it really depends on the data availability of the community. It depends on who's involved. But typically for, and also, so I would encourage anyone who's interested to reach out to us because it can be anything from an assessment of the community that they'll use all the way to a full master plan chapter update. So it really just depends on what the community is looking to get out of it.
All right, great. Thank you, Zach. And I think we're going to continue on here. I don't see any more questions coming through.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next we are going to have a panel discussion on the resilience planning, and this will be facilitated by Paul Sachs. Paul is the Director of Planning and Performance Improvement for Ottawa County in Michigan, where he is responsible for implementing innovative, pragmatic solutions that positively impact quality of life and economic growth in the county. Paul previously worked as a researcher for the Federal Highway Administration's Research and Technology Center in McLean, Virginia, and as a planning analyst for the Michael Baker Engineering firm, under contract with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, in Washington, D.C. So we'll welcome Paul, and Paul, I believe you will introduce our panelists today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rob. And thanks to Kelly and the MACC for organizing this event. I also want to say, thanks to everyone that's participating in this conference. And I much appreciated Zach's overview of coastal resiliency planning with LIAI. And the panelists that we have with us today are exceptional colleagues that I know well, and they're fantastic. And they have partnered with LIAI on coastal resiliency planning. And before I go into any introductions of the panelists, I just want to set a little bit further context on resiliency, because it's certainly an interesting topic that not everyone can grasp all the time. And I have heard some folks mention that resiliency is, it's a buzzword that may be losing its meaning. And I strongly disagree with that. And I actually read an article just recently that talked about how resiliency and planning is critical, because how we think about the world and how we think about the impacts of rising water levels and changes in weather pattern really have huge implications for the solutions that we do prioritize. And with that resilient thinking, we're able to move forward with those right solutions that will allow municipalities to thrive into the future, despite some changes that they anticipated going through this process, and perhaps even those that come as a surprise. So our three panelists with us today, as I mentioned, they've all partnered with LIAI and have conducted coastal resiliency plans. And I will introduce the three of them together here. So our first panelist is Jennifer Howland, and Jennifer has a master's in urban and regional planning from the University of Illinois. She's originally from the east side of the state, from Rochester, Michigan, and she's been the community development director for the City of Grand Haven since 2013. Our second panelist is Stacy Fedewa, and Stacy has a degree in urban and regional planning from MSU, a master's in public administration from Western, go Western. For the last 5 years, she's also served as the community development director for Grand Haven Charter Township, and then most recently for the village of Spring Lake. And our third panelist is Ms. Jenna Ellswick, and Jenna has master's degrees in both urban and regional planning and conflict resolution, which can certainly come in handy as a planner. Hey, Jenna. And Jenna is currently the senior planner for the City of Holland. So I will transfer control then over to Jennifer Howland, who can give an overview of what the City of Grand Haven has done in this space.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, everybody?
Yep, we can, Jenna. You're good.
Okay, thanks. And is my screen sharing?
It is.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. This is my first presentation using Zoom, so bear with me. I appreciate your patience. Thank you for having me today. As I was introduced, I'm with the City of Grand Haven. We are right along the shore of Lake Michigan at the mouth of the Grand River. Back in 2015, we were due for a master plan update. And LIAI approached us with a funding opportunity. And being a small community, we have, of course, limited resources, as I'm sure all of you do, especially right now. And this was a really affordable opportunity for us to focus on resiliency planning through our required 5-year master plan update. So we felt as a city that this was a planning approach for everyone. It had economic, social, and environmental focuses. And it was a chance to prepare for adverse conditions, which I feel like that's the essence of good planning. We also wanted to make sure that whatever happens in our future, that we can bounce back from them. And that's my definition of resiliency, being able to bounce back from adverse conditions. We partnered with Grand Haven Charter Township, our neighbor to the south, which made it more of a regional effort. Because as we all know, the environmental impacts of what we do, social impacts, and really economic impacts, they don't know jurisdictional boundaries. We learned a lot through this planning effort, but a few key takeaways were the city and the township are different politically, but it makes sense to plan in tandem, and different outcomes are okay. Another takeaway was not everyone embraces the concept of climate change, but pretty much everyone can get behind the idea that we should be prepared for challenges, whether they're economic, social, or environmental, and we need to have strategies for bouncing back. And then finally, moving immediately to implementation is critical to maintain momentum. We had all this wonderful engagement with the community, and we didn't want to just leave the plan on the shelf and move on to something else. We were fortunate enough to receive additional funding from the same group to work on implementing the plan that everyone adopted. So after the master plan was adopted, we were able to move forward with implementation of a few key parts of the resiliency focus to our master plan. We were able to do this during a period of low water back in 2016, 2017. We didn't have to be reactive to the imminent threat of high water, but we knew it would come. We had been shown lots of historical aerial photos of Grand Haven's shoreline changing over the decades significantly. We knew that we were in a period of low water. We knew that we were enjoying wider waterfront yards, but the history of our community was still there. We knew that that was not a permanent situation. So as a result of this and recent planning engagement, ordinances were approved without a lot of resistance. And I guess that's kind of unique. We've been sort of a model for some of these efforts I'm going to go into, but I think it was a good time for us because we were not having that imminent threat. One of the things we worked on was updating our sensitive areas overlay district. So this overlay district covers floodplains, critical dunes, steep slopes, wetlands. So we wanted to update the boundaries of that based on the latest data. Our update also focused on giving our review process more teeth, I suppose, more of a clear delineation between areas we were going to regulate and not regulate. We really wanted to have a good balance of private property rights and environmental protection. So we focused on areas outside of the building envelope in an effort to protect those property rights. And the update encourages protection of things like larger trees, encourages the use of pervious pavers, bioswales, depressed parking islands, native plantings, and things like that. Another part of this update for implementation was the creation of the Beach Overlay District. So I mentioned that we're along the shore of Lake Michigan. We have private property ownership north of the Grand River and more public property ownership south of the Grand River, the state park and just City of Grand Haven beachfront. So we created this new regulation along Lake Michigan, and lakeward of this line that you see on the screen, you can't arm the shoreline. So landward you can, lakeward you can't. No riprap, no seawalls, no sandbags. The intent of this is to protect public access along the shoreline, and it also prevents erosion of unarmed neighboring properties. So The beach overlay district is a line created by adding the 50-year floodplain elevation and the 60-year projected recession distance. And through the whole planning effort with LIAI and partners, this great data was developed, and now we have a regulation for it. I will say that we already had a successful waterfront setback requirement, so we don't have the situation where a bunch of homes are continually creep closer and closer to the lake. Everyone has been held back by their adjacent neighbors for quite a few decades. So that's been in our favor as well. So this overlay district, especially in like 2017, was not a huge deal for homeowners. They didn't see where it was a big deal. Now that the lake levels are higher, we are getting quite a bit of erosion. And we have some homeowners that have been seeking variances to at least do some temporary erosion control. Another thing that we worked on was a homeowners guidebook. So we wanted to create an easy to understand document for homeowners to raise awareness of sensitive features of their property and give them simple ways that they can help protect it. Again, it's not a heavy-handed requirement. It's really just a series of recommendations. I think that it's a good baseline. We could certainly do more, but again, it gives them something to work with. And we try to pass this out to people when they're applying for building permits in the sensitive areas. We also did a big mailing when it was first published, so everybody knows it's out there. And implementation continues today. I really believe that our zoning ordinance is a living document. We do text amendments regularly. We don't wait for a big update, but we are in the middle of a larger update of our zoning ordinance. We're just about ready to hold our public hearing in a few weeks. It's been over a year since we started this, and of course things slowed down because of COVID, but we've had some really good engagement, a lot of creative ways to engage. And the zoning ordinance update is focusing on ways to help our community continue to be resilient by offering more housing options like accessory dwelling units and smaller dwelling unit size minimums, encouraging shared use of our finite space for businesses and parking because we can't grow, we're a contained city, and giving residents options for creating independent food sources. So that's all very much related to resiliency. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm looking forward to discussion afterwards.
Nice. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Yeah, we'll have our next two panelists will go, and then we'll have it open up for questions. But for those that may have questions now, feel free to add them into the comments section, and we'll be sure to go back through those. Thank you. Up next, we have Stacy Fedewa.
All right, is it a full screen for everybody else?
It is not right now.
Okay, I don't know why it's not. Start from the beginning. There we go. And Paul, I'm sorry, my last name is pronounced Fedewa. That's okay. I mean, I accepted it was, back in the day, it was a lot easier when we had telemarketers calling home lines with cords. If they said your last name wrong, you knew it was a telemarketer. And so, okay. Perfect. So I am with Haven Township, and my presentation is called The Struggle is Real and Timing is Everything. And you will be able to draw some parallels to Jennifer's about how her beach overlay zone was adopted at the right time. And my attempt at it was the wrong time and was not included in our ordinance. So these are kind of the main problems that we experienced. We were kind of looking at this at climate change, water shortages, longer winters, hotter summers, and ultimately how development impacts all of that. So ultimately our implementation was, we adopted the Resilient Master Plan, which we developed in coordination with the City of Grand Haven. And that was adopted in 2016. We have also adopted a resilient zoning ordinance, which was officially adopted in March of 2020. We did start working on that in May of 2017. So it took a bit longer, but we hadn't had a zoning ordinance update since 1999. And you can imagine we've had quite a bit of differences since then. I mean, we were concerned about Y2K back then. So that's kind of an idea of how much change has happened. And in addition, a lot of coordination happens. We are a township, so we don't have jurisdiction over like our roads, and working with the Ottawa County Water Resources Commissioner is a big deal, especially for all of the new development. We tend to consider ourselves the residential aspect of Grand Haven, and the city is really the heart and the downtown, and we provide a lot of the residential. And so as new development is occurring, we're working really close with the county to ensure that the green infrastructure is really part of the new development. And okay. So Mother Nature and political impacts. This really shows the timing. On the left, you're able to see the provisions, the regulations that we had written into the draft of the zoning ordinance in our resiliency chapter, which includes a 200-foot setback from Lake Michigan that we would start measuring at the ordinary high water mark of the 580.5. And our township has 95% of it along our 7-mile border of Lake Michigan is within the critical dune areas, and 100% of it is high-risk erosion areas. We also have major changes in elevation. The city's residential side tends to be pretty flat along the lakeshore. It is not the same for the township. We do a little bit in the north, which you're seeing on the top image here of how we would have implemented a 200-foot setback triangle, and then more of an average lot on the bottom there. So those were included along with a prohibition against seawalls. And but ultimately in December of 2019 and January 2020, when we were moving through the adoption process, the homeowners along the lake were right in the midst of complete crisis of extreme erosion along the shoreline. And you'll see a couple photos coming up here. And so rightfully so, I do believe that the board made the correct decision to not include these provisions at this time. I wish they would have, but ultimately during a crisis mode, during an election year, it was never going to be feasible to allow that seawall prohibition to occur, nor the setback. Now, we might be able to in a couple of years when this is still fresh with everyone's mind. So I'm hopeful for that. So here's an example. It's the last real big erosion event that we had was in 1986. And it's been 33 years. And I tend to ask myself the question of, is hindsight eluding us? Because we're still having the same problems we did in 33 years ago. We had fewer houses fall into the lake. But here's an example of 2 homes, and the photo on the left is from August 1st of 2019, and 86 days later is October 25th, and you can see that it has eroded up to the foundations of both homes. And lakefront properties with neighbors and easements, etc., it's messy all the time. And there was an emergency revetment application for these 2 homeowners, but there are a series of easements within this area, and there was disputes from neighbors. The state provided them a temporary permit to install sandbags for protection because we really thought these houses were going to fall in. And they filed a lawsuit against everyone, and they ultimately did have a judge that was really willing to become involved and did multiple site visits, and eventually ruled in favor of the 2 property owners, and they were allowed to install the revetments and protect the properties. And here's a video that I was able to find, and I wonder if it's going to play. It appears, oh, there we go. And so this is actually from 1986, and you can see the wooden seawalls that they installed in the 70s are still visible. They're visible again in 2019, 2020, but just the erosion is extreme. And you're able to see some of those houses that did fall in, others that are right along the brink of it. And then if we go to the next slide. Come on, next slide. So then we really tried to figure out what resiliency solutions actually made it into our zoning ordinance. You could be wondering, we do have some low impact development, native species requirements, and construction setbacks. Fortunately, the construction setbacks aren't as much as I'd like them to be, but we do have a 10-foot setback from all county drains, which is an improvement, particularly because we have so much agriculture in our township and a lot of pesticides can run off in there. We're working on other setbacks like the lakefront. It's just tough during high water times. So we do have a few projects that I've been working on that were a direct result of our resiliency master plan. The biggest one is a natural shoreline at Pottawattomie Park. You're going to see more of that on the next slide. We also had about 70 acres donated to the township called Schmidt Heritage Park. And we're going to start construction on that in the next year or so. And we will be having a completely green infrastructure with rain gardens, et cetera, with the idea being this, we want this to be an example for developers to even go and see and confirm that our township believes in our plans. And we want to follow our own ordinances to also help set the standard. We also have a boat launch where the wrong plantings were used in the past and non-native plants were unable to thrive in wet soil. And we didn't have any filtration around our detention basins. And so we are going to be correcting that either this year or next year. So Pottawattomie Park, you can see in the lower left corner, we were losing an extreme amount of frontage of shoreline here. We just had extreme accelerated erosion. We're not sure of the exact cause, but we know we have some seeps. We had problems with ice churning around the bottom of our fixed portion of the dock that was causing problems. The boardwalk you can see was originally built on land. Almost all of it's over water now. If we were to include the 2019-2020 erosion that we've experienced, we're closer to probably 50-60 feet that we've lost. If you can see that dock, that grass has eroded all the way back to the sidewalk now. Similarly, on this top photo of the shore, you can see that white pipe sticking out, and that's our irrigation. So that used to be all covered, and like I said, it's eroded back to the sidewalk. We did some community engagement, and you can see that below of what our intention is. And then the photos on the left or on the right are part of a natural shoreline project and a diagram of such. Other resiliency provisions we added in as a recommendation for a 75% natural shoreline. So that way, you know, they can at least stop. Geese are a big problem and ducks on yards that are just turf grass. And so we're recommending this. It's just a recommendation though. It's not something we're enforcing. As for development, where xeriscaping is highly encouraged and there's a 75% requirement of all native species being used, a list of which is provided here along with the secondary benefits such as LH, which is a larval host for butterflies. On a personal note, I really want to save bees and butterflies. So you can see in our stormwater ponds here, we're requiring pollinator flowers for the honeybees along with milkweed to help the monarch butterflies. And that is my presentation, and I believe it is Jenna's turn now.
Nice. Thanks so much for that great overview, Stacy. A lot of challenges, and you've had some great accomplishments with your solutions so far. So thank you again.
Thank you, Paul.
All right, Jenna.
Yes, hello. Let me get it up here. Okay, I'm assuming you can also see mine?
Yep, we're all set.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Jenna Ellswick, Senior Planner of the City of Holland. Now the City of Holland is actually not located exactly on Lake Michigan. we're a bit inland. So when we worked with LIA starting in 2015, it wasn't so much based on the coastal element, but more so on what you can do from a resiliency perspective inland. So this was our most recent resiliency planning process, and it started with the Resilient Holland project, that kicked off actually our master planning process back in 2015. And it culminated with the adoption of the master plan in 2017. So this progressive master plan, which unfortunately I can't take any credit for because it was before my time, it sets forth goals and action steps within 9 different topics, all though with the resiliency lens, such as encouraging low impact development strategies, planting native species, encouraging sustainable practices, and educating on green infrastructure treatments and benefits. Resilient Holland, with help from LIA, also collected a variety of data identifying resiliency issues such as the most vulnerable populations in the city to extreme heat events, as well as assessed where the city's urban tree canopy is the most substantial and where it's sparse. This is really very important because most of those areas that you see here that are not covered with trees are in our commercial and industrial zone districts and corridors, which happens to be where most new development would occur, at least large development in the city, and where larger parking lots are currently located. The plan also provides critical data on where the soils drain the best and where they don't. Again, this is largely in that commercial and industrial area, all of which really needs to be considered in site designing to implement resiliency. Now, we have yet to actually implement our master plan. However, enter UDO. UDO is our Unified Development Ordinance. We've been working on it with McKenna Associates for the last 2 years. And it will be the way that we implement the master plan and our resiliency action steps that were laid out then. The UDO is a pretty progressive new way of zoning, which actually combines all development related ordinances together to one place, such as zoning, subdivisions, streets, sidewalks, or it at least provides a reference to them, such as the fire code. And it also is proposing progressive resiliency zoning requirements as well as other new innovative zoning requirements. One example of this is improving our landscape requirements and also the addition of green infrastructure requirements that would work in conjunction with our stormwater ordinance for all new developments that require a site plan approval, substantial additions, or parking lot retrofits. Focusing in on trees, since we do know that they slow rainwater runoff, they provide water and air quality benefits, they in part at least combat extreme heat, and certainly they're the most welcomed in the sense that people that don't know about green infrastructure certainly do know about trees. So we're adding to our existing requirements to require trees in parking lot islands, and also to require a certain amount of parking lot islands in those larger parking lots with more than 20 spaces. We're also increasing or really clarifying more our current existing standards, such as our requirement for trees along the street frontages for any new development or substantial addition, and then parking lot perimeter landscaping, building perimeter landscaping, and requiring residential buffers when it's a commercial or industrial next to a residential zone district. Now, we've determined that site design is really one of the most impactful ways to implement the identified resiliency master plan action steps, like the low impact development strategies, sustainable practices, and also to meaningfully respond to the data that was collected by LIAI and the city, such as the soil drainage and the tree coverage. So acknowledging all of this, we're also going kind of one step further and proposing a to me, very exciting and innovative requirement within our UDO to require developments, again, those requiring site plan approval, to incorporate at least one structural green infrastructure treatment from this list. So permeable surface, and in the ordinance, we have images and list out what those surfaces are. Green roof, living wall, vertical garden, rain garden, bioswale, or combined green and conventional infrastructure like a tree box filter, as well as another type that might be proposed and then approved by whomever is doing the review process. We are still, though, working on developing these standards further because we definitely want it to be something that's going to be at least somewhat impactful. We don't want someone to say, okay, I'll plant, you know, a really small little rain garden here and call it a day. So we're working on this. We're looking at other best practices, and certainly, you know, I'd love to reach out to all of you that if you have any ideas or if other communities have done anything like this, if you could send them along my way, that would be greatly appreciated. Also, unlike most zoning ordinances, the UDO is also including some resiliency guidelines. These are not required, but they're strongly recommended best practices, say for public street design to incorporate green infrastructure treatments, and for residents to implement best practices such as water harvesting, washing vehicles on lawns, among others that we got from the MACC. Thank you very much, Kelly. And really striving to implement resiliency efforts wherever and whenever possible. So still to come, we're currently obtaining public comment on these resiliency requirements and other proposed UDO changes on our UDO website, which is hollandudo.com. We'd love for you to take a look at it. And like I said, you know, the more comments and suggestions, the better. We definitely want to learn from what has worked in the area. So ideas are certainly welcome. And we're trying to get into the public hearing process by the end of the year, fingers crossed. But staff and planning commission, we're very excited about these proposed resiliency implementation standards, and we're very much looking forward to receiving comments from the general public and from all of you, please, and proposing the UDO for adoption to City Council soon. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jenna, for that overview. And thanks again to Jennifer and Stacy. I do see in the chat we have a question. It's actually a two-part question. So for our panelists, part one, have your resiliency plans and zoning helped your community receive any outside funding to address issues from our record lake levels? And then part two, have you seen a real benefit realized from your community for your community as a result of going through this important planning process?
So I'll start first. As far as record lake levels, not as much. Now the lakes are increasing, obviously backing up the water in the Grand River and the Bayou. So that has caused the erosion at Pottawattomie Park and resulted in me being able to receive funding from NOAA and the state to work on a natural shoreline plan. And as far as the realized benefits from the community, To me, it's more so been a benefit for the my boss and the township board as we're looking at projects. The first proposal for Pottawattomie Park was a steel seawall, and I about fell out of my chair when I read that. And so I was fortunate to be able to point to our master plan and say, this is not what we are believing in and what we told the community we believed in. And so that enabled me to pursue this grant funding opportunity.
That's great.
I would say we haven't received any funding as a result of this, other than all the generous funding we received for the master planning effort and the implementation. It was super affordable, so we're very thankful for that. One benefit that I've realized is I'm on the emergency management team for the city, and my role there is a lot clearer for me now that we've gone through the resiliency planning effort. So I just feel like it helps knit all these aspects together.
Thank you. Jenna, anything additional to add?
So, I mean, we aren't on the lake, so we don't really have that. And we'll see what happens in terms of community reaction and buy-in with the adoption of the UDO. So more to come next year.
Excellent. I think maybe I have a two-part question as well for you all. And I guess from your perspective, how important is it that other communities, shoreline or not, think about their planning process through the lens of resiliency? And what would you suggest should be their number one priorities to take a look at moving forward?
If I could start, I would say that, as I mentioned before, having the three different things, it's sustainability planning. I feel like it's the new word for sustainability planning. You have to know your audience and be able to touch on the economic benefits, social and environmental, because then you're going to capture everyone in the audience pretty much. Using local examples of where you've had to bounce back from adversity, or right now with the high water levels, if you have issues with that, just keeping it really practical, and then sneaking in the regulations that help the other things that they may not care about, I guess, in an open way.
I would say that my number one recommendation would be to start with that master plan, if not even a full master plan, but a chapter or even a report to identify those action steps. But I would also recommend taking it one step further in order to identify who exactly is going to be responsible for those action steps. And then by doing that, you can determine if there are particular zoning changes that need to be made, because our master plan is wonderful. The only thing I would say is that there's a lot of action steps that really my team, we don't have any control of whatsoever. So if it could have been divided more, that would have been helpful. And we still use it daily, so it's definitely been of value. And certainly we're looking forward to this implementation and seeing, hoping that it makes a substantial impact.
Thank you, Jim.
For my township, the landscaping has really been paramount. There are so many opportunities to address green infrastructure just through the landscaping, whether it's plant choices, specific grading, like depressing the landscape islands, using native species. Many times I'm encouraging, so our developers, whenever I'm doing pre-application meetings with them, I'm constantly urging them to look at other alternatives. like your whole parking lot is sloping this way, which is the opposite of where your actual detention basin is. And if you want to keep it this way, then go ahead and let's put a big rain garden on this side. I haven't been successful with a rain garden yet, but the stormwater basins have been very successful so far. So I'm still having to look at a lot of seed mixes to ensure that a number of the items we want are in there. But I feel like for us, it's making small changes that will hopefully accumulate to a bigger impact. And it's also knowing your audience. And this is a very conservative community, so I have to ensure that what I'm proposing is palatable for those that are elected officials representing our community. And so I continue to try and find that balance.
Thank you. Yes, always a balance on how we navigate through these decision processes. And yeah, I'll add too that, you know, landscape, a shift in the way we think about landscaping is incredibly important from our perspective too. And we're thinking countywide, and the irony is we're talking about better landscape design and requirements, not because necessarily of too much water, but many of you on this Zoom call know that because there's many areas of Ottawa County where we're having a decline in groundwater supply. So better landscaping, I fully support that. We did have another question come through on the chat. And this one is, I wonder how the panelists are using resiliency as part of equitable planning and protecting vulnerable residents. Who would like to take that first?
If I could jump in real quickly. So we're definitely keeping that into consideration. Like I had mentioned in my presentation, looking at where the vulnerabilities, the resiliency vulnerabilities occur within the city, and making sure that we're targeting through our zoning, at least, where we can, to combat those vulnerabilities. And certainly those often, as we know, unfortunately do rest within low to mod affordable areas. So we definitely want to address that and to be very proactive.
Thank you. Okay, well, we are, unless Stacy or Jennifer have anything else to add, I think we are at our time now, I believe, on the agenda. Unless Robert Kelly, is there anything additional?
No, Paul,
Otherwise, I will say quickly, sorry, thank you very much to the panelists. We really appreciate your time.
Yep, and thank you, Paul, for facilitating that, and also, yeah, thank you to Jenna, Jennifer, and Stacy for being willing to help us out here today. So, in closing, I'd like to thank you for attending the Planning Green Stormwater Infrastructure in a Changing World. So keep an eye out for an email that will be sent out with links to all the recordings, presentations, and a survey. Please do fill out that survey. Your feedback is valuable to us. So. Also like to take a quick moment to thank Dana Bird and Dennis Cole for their participation in planning this event, and also to our sponsors, Kennedy Solutions Incorporated, Advanced Drainage Systems, Prine and Newhoff, and the Grand Valley Metro Council. Also would ask that you would save the date for our 2021 Green Infrastructure Seminar. It is scheduled currently for August 19, 2021 at the Civic Center Place in Holland, Michigan. We look forward to seeing you all there, and thank you very much for attending today.
Thanks, everybody.